Hello and welcome to this Brisbane Writers Festival online event. My name is Michaela Kalowski and it's my great pleasure to be here today in conversation with Sinan Aral about his book, The Hype Machine. Before we get going, I wanted to start by paying my respects to the traditional custodians and owners of the land I'm on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where the Brisbane Writers Festival is, the Yugara and the Turrbal people. On behalf of the festival, I acknowledge Torres Strait Islander people who might be watching and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Sinan Aral has been studying and analysing social media for 20 years. He's sort of been called the first scholar of social media. His book, the whole title is The Hype Machine: How Social Media Disrupts Our Elections, Our Economy and Our Health, and How We Must Adapt. Now, whether we like it or not, every aspect of our lives depends on billions of social media connections around the world. And as his colleagues say in the start of this book, no one understands those connections better than Sinan Aral. This conversation is going to span how social media shapes everything in your life, the way we vote, what we buy, how we buy, who we choose to be romantic with, everything about every aspect of our lives, including fake news and real news. But while everyone has a theory about how social media works, Sinan Aral is unusual because he actually brings the science, and that's going to be a big focus of the conversation today. As he describes himself, he is a scientist, an entrepreneur, and an investor, in that order. He analyzes large-scale social media data for a living to try and make sense of how information and behavior are diffused through social media and society. He is the David Austin Professor of Management, Marketing, IT, and Data Science at MIT. He also directs the initiative on the digital economy, and he's the head of their social analytics lab. He and his colleagues there studies the social technologies that make up what he refers to as the hype machine, which he'll explain to us today. He has also co-founded Manifest Capital, a VC fund that grows startups into the hype machine. And he's worked closely with Facebook, Yahoo, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, WeChat, and the New York Times. And he's also earned his PhD at MIT and his master's degree at the London School of Economics and at Harvard. He currently serves on some incredible advisory boards, including the Alan Turing Institute, the British National Institute for Data Science in London, and he's also on the board of the C6 Bank, one of the first all-digital banks in Brazil. He's actually an applied econometrician by training, and when you read the book, that all makes sense because no one uses graphs the way Sinan Aral uses a graph. He's also studied sociology and social psychology, and you can really tell that when you read the book. Sinan Aral, welcome to Brisbane Writers Festival.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a true honor.
I wanted to jump right in. You call this book The Hype Machine. What does that name encompass? What does that name explain about social media, the way we use it, and why did you choose that name?
Yeah, so the hype machine refers in part to the business model that social media runs on, which is essentially a model of engagement and attention. So the hype machine operates in the attention economy in that these platforms sell our attention as opportunities for persuasion in advertising. So the real business model of a Facebook or a Twitter is essentially to get our attention and then to allow people to use that moment of attention to advertise. And it could be a product, it could be a public health initiative, it could be a foreign intervention by a foreign government in an election. But really, they are selling attention. And the way they get and keep our attention is to hype us up. By getting us engaged, by keeping us sort of emotionally attracted, by keeping us hyped up, they get more of our attention, more focused attention, they keep it for a longer period of time, and that drives the business model.
You've been studying social media for a very long time. When did the name, The Hype Machine, sort of come to you? When did it start to make sense? I suppose I'm asking how social media has evolved, particularly in the last 20 years.
Well, interestingly, social media began with different types of intentions. You frequently hear what Mark Zuckerberg had been saying for a long time when he originally started Facebook, which was that he wanted to connect the world. He wanted to give people access to life-saving health information and to give people access to job opportunities, economic opportunities, meaningful human connection, and so on. And at some point, this business model needed to be monetized. They needed to find a way to make money from providing all of these things to the world. And there were some choices that were made. In particular, you could imagine this running on a subscription model where people paid a monthly fee to have access to all of this value. Or alternatively, this advertising business model. And at some point, a decision was made to go with advertising. In Facebook's case, it really was operationalized and institutionalized with the hiring of Sheryl Sandberg. And in fact, they were selling ads before that, but it became a highly optimized business under her leadership.
Would you say now that maybe we've got the tail wagging the dog? If it started out, as you say, with this idea of bringing information to people, health information, choices about purchases, choices about decisions about elections, or sharing information so people could stay connected, and it had to, in order for it to work, in order for it to sustain itself, to monetize itself, it sold advertising. Is it now almost all about the advertising? Is that one of our concerns or your concerns?
Not really. So I actually think that both elements, what I call the promise and the peril, are always present, and they have been present for some time now, almost equally. In other words, I think we need to get past this debate about whether social media is good or evil. The answer is yes. Social media is good and evil. And we really need to understand how we can achieve the promise and avoid the peril at the same time. And I'll give you an example. What I mean by that is that we still today have a tremendous amount of life-saving health information, meaningful human connection, economic opportunity that is experienced on social media every single day by hundreds of millions of people. But we also have a tremendous wave of falsity and fake news, of election manipulation, polarizing algorithms, and so on. And so we have both the promise and the peril present in our experience in social media. Now, in terms of the way we see the promise and the peril, we went through a decade of what I call techno-utopianism, where we were focused on the potential, the amazing potential of social media, followed by a decade of techno-dystopianism, where the sky was falling and social media is going to destroy our democracies, our public health, on our economies, and so on. And we see a lot of really negative effects of social media every single day. But I think we have to transcend this dichotomy between the utopian view and the dystopian view and realize that the reality is a lot muddier than that. It's both the promise and the peril. We have to get nuanced and rigorous about how we can deal with the details, because the devil is really in the details in terms of whether we achieve the promise and whether we can sort of quiet the peril.
I want to talk in a moment with you about fake news and about elections and about the way that social media might be shaping how we understand the world geopolitically. But before we do that, I feel like we need to have a sense of how the hype machine actually works on our brains. And I know there's been a fantastic documentary called The Social Dilemma, which a lot of people have seen. So people are really starting to sort of peel the layers of the onion away. But can you talk a bit about what happens neurologically that allows the hype machine and our brain to be so engaged with each other? Why are we so utterly enthralled?
So I love this movie, The Social Dilemma. I highly recommend people see it if they haven't. Many of my friends are in this movie. It's a great movie. It's not the first, though. Before The Social Dilemma, there was The Great Hack. We've had books like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, great books. Zucked by Roger McNamee. And these are all great books and movies, and they really raise the clarion call of the dangers of social media, and they're really important in their role in doing that. But in a sense, my book takes off where those books and movies leave off, which is to ask, what can we do about social media? How do we solve this crisis? What is the social solution if there's a social dilemma? And that is the point of my book. Now, the theme of how we do that is to get rigorous and nuanced about how it works under the hood scientifically. And that story begins with the neuroscience, as you said. Now, I have a 7-year-old son, so I was very, very interested in knowing how these kinds of digital technologies are affecting our brains. And that chapter, which is called Your Brain on Social Media, which goes through all the neuroscience evidence of what happens in our brains when we use social media, both goes through how it affects adults and how it affects adolescents and kids and so on. And so there's some really fascinating stories that I discovered in researching that chapter. So one of the interesting questions is, why is our brain so big? Why is the human brain so big relative to our body weight? It is one of the largest brains relative to body weight of any species on the planet. We have one of the largest neocortex ratios of any species on the planet. That's the neocortex relative to the rest of our brain. And the leading hypothesis for why this is the case is called the social brain hypothesis, which is that we essentially evolved to process social signals. We are one of the most complex social species on the planet. We have organizations of hundreds of thousands of people in the same organization. We collaborate and cooperate at scale across digital technologies. And the way we've done that is our brains have essentially evolved to process these complex social signals in a very complex social hierarchy and social order. And what do I mean by that? Well, human beings are fifth order intentional. We're long believed to be one of the only species that are fifth order intentional. What does that mean? Well, if I know that Joe is African, that's first order intentionality. If I know that Jill knows, that Bob knows, that Tim knows, that Sally knows that Joe is African, that's 5 hops away from me in the social network. And if I can think about what somebody is thinking about 5 hops away from me, that's fifth order intentional. Really only human beings and maybe one species of ape is fifth order intentional. And so when you think about this hundreds of millions of years of evolution of the human brain, which evolved to process social signals, and then you think, wow, then we invented a technology that delivers real-time streams of hundreds of millions of social signals to our brains every single day in what people are liking, sharing, commenting on, what my cousin ate for dinner last night with a picture of it on Instagram, how my, nieces and nephews are doing on in school, on Facebook, and so on. Then the meteoric rise of social media is no surprise. In fact, it's no surprise at all because it's like tossing a lit match into a pool of gasoline. That combination of understanding human evolution with where the hype machine fits into that evolution really gives you a sense of the neuroscience. Then the chapter talks about this notion of the dopamine reward system, where the likes, comments, and shares that we get on social media stimulate the dopamine reward system in our brains. They deliver dopamine to our brains, which we have learned to crave. And this keeps us coming back for more. When we get likes, comments, and shares on our content, we get dopamine. That dopamine inspires us to want to have that more. So we want to come back and share more and get more likes, comments, and shares. And in fact, Sean Parker told the journalist Mike Allen in 2017 that, yes, we actually designed Facebook to be that way, to give you that little jolt of dopamine, to keep you coming back for more. And all of these stories are told in the chapter on neuroscience, as well as, for instance, one more story. There are many, but one more really interesting one. When UCLA did a neuroscience experiment where they used Instagram-style pictures and they randomly assigned some pictures to have more likes than others just to see what likes did to the brain, they did this for images that displayed risky behaviors like taking drugs and alcohol and neutral behaviors. And what they found was that getting more likes randomly assigned on pictures of risky behaviors turn down our response inhibition networks in our kids' brains, meaning the natural tendency for us to think, maybe that's risky, maybe that's not such a good idea, maybe I should be careful here. That system in the brain is turned down as images of risky behaviors get more likes on Instagram. Those types of insights were absolutely essential for me as a parent, and shocking and eye-opening. And so I try to tell those stories in the chapter on neuroscience.
It's a bit like the part of the brain where if everyone's jumping off a cliff, we go, maybe I'll jump off a cliff. It doesn't look so bad.
We're lemurs when we get more likes of people jumping off cliffs.
And as an aside, the Instagram in the last, I don't know when it was, maybe 6 months ago, maybe longer, actually did away with that functionality where you can't see anymore how many likes an image gets. Has anyone studied what impact that has on how people feel about the material they're sharing?
So they're only experimenting with that now. You can see how many likes an image gets.
You have to click through.
You have to click through, but right now what they're doing is they are running experiments where in some parts of their network, they are eliminating your ability to see likes. And in other parts of the network, they're keeping it and they're studying what effect this has on behavior. And one thing that people need to be aware of is that at any given moment, there are thousands of these types of experiments happening to everyone using social media. At any moment, you are in 1,000 different experiments for what color should the bar be, and should it be on the right or the left, or should we hide likes or show them, and so on, just to study what might happen to behavior as they change the algorithms in one direction or the other. And that's a constant of social media development.
You detailed beautifully before and you described the way that social media was designed to mirror the way that humans relate to each other. But you also write powerfully about the way that the hype machine hyper-socializes us. Can you talk a little bit about that before we get to talking about fake news and emotional arousal?
Sure. It used to be that we made decisions on our own without too much input from other people. In fact, Robert Shiller, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, people generally tend to make decisions on their own without too much input from other people. That's no longer true. And the reason for that is because we have so much access to other people's opinions about every choice we might make, which restaurant to go to, which shoe to buy, which trail on the hiking map is the more beautiful one. It's so populated with other people's opinions now that I think the reverse is true, that we almost never make decisions anymore without being inundated with other people's opinions. And so hypersocialization, and there's a whole chapter on it, describes what does a world look like in which every decision, every piece of information has accumulated with it what the crowd thinks about it, what our friends think about it, and how many likes does it have, how many shares does it have, how many comments does it have, and so on.
Later on, I want to ask you about regulation as well, about what are the ways we can maybe curtail or grapple with the responsibility that we all have now, all the stakeholders that use social media. But I wonder to some extent if, from what you just described, that it's actually how human beings react to this machine, to respond to these systems. Are we kind of the architects of our own misfortune? Is it actually just a function of the human brain that makes the hype machine as powerful and as effective as it is?
It's a little of both. So what I tried to describe in the book is this notion of the hype loop, which is how these algorithms interface with our brains to create the outcomes that we see. And the hype loop is this dynamic interplay of machine intelligence on one hand and human agency on the other. So the machine, the algorithms and in fact, there are two really major categories of algorithms that matter. One are the friend suggestion algorithms, or what are known as the people you may know algorithms that suggest who we should link to next in the social network. Those guide the evolution of the human social network online. And then what are known as the feed algorithms, which show us different stories, advertisements, and so on. That's the running list of things that we can read, or videos that we can view, or the images that we can see on Instagram in any given moment. So you've got the people you may know or friend suggestion algorithms and the feed algorithms. And these two algorithms work in a hype loop where the machine understands, it tries to reason about what we like, what we share, what we comment on, what we read, how we're reacting to things in order to suggest new things, new news stories, new videos, new images, new people to connect to, and so on. But then we take these recommendations and we make choices about them. So we choose to discard some recommendations and act on others. That's the human agency in the hype loop. And this dynamic interplay of the machine intelligence and the humans making the decisions based on the recommendations is what creates the outcomes that we see. And the real sort of takeaway from that is that it's not technological determinism that determines our fates. The algorithm just chooses our reality for us. And it's not just that we have complete and utter free will to go wherever we want. The machine enables and constrains our reality, but we also actualize that reality. So neither side can really abdicate responsibility. The platforms have to be responsible for the way the algorithms are designed, and people have to be responsible for the choices that they're making as well.
Very quickly, before we talk about fake news, I wanted to ask your opinion on this idea of real life and online life. Whether, as you said, we no longer are really able to make decisions about, what we dress our children in or how we embrace our partners or what records we buy without looking online. But do we need to encourage people to make a distinction between the life they live physically in their bodies with the people around them and between the life they live online? Do you think those distinctions are useful in terms of where we're up to now?
I think that these distinctions have blurred almost completely. I think that now our offline world is completely immersed in an online world. And I think that our online world is very interlinked with our offline world. Why is that? Well, we carry these supercomputers called smartphones in our pockets everywhere we go. And these things are sensing so much about our lives and are feeding that data into the hype machine's algorithms in terms of what to recommend next. That includes our locations, our behaviors, our demographics, our friends, their behaviors, their locations, and so on. And these machines, what I call the input-output device of the medium of the hype machine, this smartphone currently, also delivers real-time recommendations to our pockets and to our brains everywhere we go. And we are conditioned to look at them very often because they buzz and they light up and they notify us that we have a new share, a new like, a new comment, and the dopamine reward system is triggered by that. And so we're drawn to it. And the fact that these notifications come to us on a variable reinforcement schedule, meaning they could come at any time, means that we're constantly wondering, when am I going to get the next like? When am I going to get the next buzz on my phone? And so we're in this loop of always being plugged into it, whether we're offline in the physical world or not. That's why I recommend, for instance, turning off notifications, scheduling your use of social media. There are ways to separate it. They're currently not very well separated.
Let's dive into fake news. I was surprised when I read your book to discover that there are almost no longitudinal studies of what fake news is, of how it's proliferated, of where it comes from, and of why it's so effective. Can you talk a bit about that, the study that you and your colleagues did and what you discovered? Because it blew my mind.
So chapter 2 of the book is called The End of Reality, and it considers a world in which falsity online essentially takes over. And it details the potential perilous impacts of this for our democracies and our elections on one hand, our economies on the other, and our public health. And so in thinking about those three areas, democracy, economy, and public health, you can think about election manipulation, right? So in 2016 in the United States, where I live in New York, Russia propagated manipulative messages to 126 million people on Facebook, 20 million on Instagram, 10 million tweets from accounts with 6 million followers on Twitter, and 43 hours of YouTube content. I tell the story of how a single false tweet in April 2013 from Syrian hackers that had hacked the AP News handle wiped out $140 billion in equity value in the stock market in a matter of minutes by claiming that Barack Obama, then President Barack Obama, had been injured or killed in an explosion in the White House. And I detail the impacts of misinformation on the trajectory of the coronavirus pandemic and the measles epidemic before it. Now, in order to solve this problem, the spread of fake news, we have to understand how it works. How does misinformation propagate? And you're right, there haven't been very many longitudinal studies, but we did one where we looked at 10 years of Twitter history. We had access to the entire Twitter historical archive, and we looked at all of the true and false news that verified true and false news that spread on Twitter over that 10-year period. And this paper was published on the cover of Science magazine in 2018. What we found was very scary. We found that false news diffused farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied, and sometimes by an order of magnitude, on average 6 times faster than the truth, which was a tremendously eye-opening result for me as a scientist to see that. And once you hear that result, it's maybe not surprising that that would end up on the cover of Science, because that is truly a really important result for our society, our global civic society. And then we started researching why this was the case. And that was equally fascinating, because we originally thought, well, maybe people who spread false news just have more followers, or maybe they follow more people, or maybe they're more often verified or tweet more often. So we checked all these in turn, and we found that the opposite was true for each one of these, that essentially fake news spreaders had fewer followers, followed fewer people, were less often verified, had been on Twitter for less time, and tweeted less often. So then we were left with why? Then why is fake news traveling so far and fast? And it turns out that it's because fake news is really surprising, shocking, anger-inducing. And we discovered this by examining how novel fake news was compared to the truth, and it was just way more novel. We found that people replied to fake news expressing a lot more anger, disgust, and surprise. So essentially, fake news is blood boiling. It's shocking, and it's this shock and awe that makes us 70% more likely to retweet false news than true news.
I was really surprised to read as well that when people come into contact with fake news, they're then also less likely to trust real news once they've had that experience. Why is that?
Well, so the idea of, I think what you're referring to is this notion of the implied truth effect.
Yes.
Which is one of the really potentially very effective solutions to false news is labeling, where you would label the provenance and the veracity and the reliability of the news and the sources, right? So just to give a brief analogy, when you go to the grocery store to buy food to consume, it's extensively labeled. You know how many calories it has, how many trans fats, if it's produced in a facility that produces wheat and peanuts, if you have an allergy. And all of this is labeled by law. But the information we consume is almost not labeled at all. We're sort of on our own to discern, where does this come from? Should I trust this? What's in this? Is this good to put into my body or not? And so labeling can be very effective because it allows us to make better choices and decisions. And large-scale studies show that, nudging people to be reflective and labeling things can help reduce the belief and sharing of false news. But if you don't label everything at scale, it's also been shown that people just assume that things that aren't labeled must be true, because they say to themselves, well, if you as a platform are labeling things for me and you're labeling fake news and this particular piece of news isn't labeled, then it must be true. You're implying that that which isn't labeled is true, and that is the implied truth effect. And kudos, by the way, to David Rand and Gordon Pennycook for that research.
While we're here, what's the distinction between misinformation and disinformation? Because you talk about that in the book and it's important.
Disinformation is the willful propagation of false news for a deleterious reason. Misinformation is just mistakes, news that's false, but that isn't being used in a manipulative and manner designed to manipulate. Disinformation has the goal of using falsity to manipulate for deleterious reasons.
How can we spot fake news? Throughout the book, and in these chapters, you also talk about the use of bots. That, you know, a person with an actual account sends off a tweet, and then that tweet gets picked up and retweeted, sometimes by people with very few followers, sometimes by bots. How can we look at the proliferation of news stories around, and is there any way for us to spot something that is fake?
So one of the really fascinating stories in the book for me, and sort of an investigative sociology of fake news, what that reveals is this really fascinating symbiosis between humans and bots working together to spread false news. And in that symbiosis, the bots sort of pounce on falsity first and try to nudge humans to spread it. And then they successfully, many times, get humans to spread it, especially famous humans that have a lot of influence and followers. Once they can nudge those humans to spread it, then it spreads even further. And that symbiosis between humans and bots is responsible for the proliferation of fake news. And so if we're really trying to spot fake news as human beings, there's a couple of sort of rules of thumb. So one thing that I notice on my social media feeds is that whenever I see fake news come across the transom on my social media, it's usually preceded by this preamble that says, I don't know if this is true, but it's really interesting if it is. And then we share it, right? Well, we got to stop doing that. Fake news is designed to be really interesting if it's true, but it's not. And that's sort of the catch. Point two is that the 80-20 rule applies, meaning a lot of the fake news can be easily debunked by a single Google search or a search online, just to see, is this true, before sharing it, with the first or second click being a link to a debunking of that article. And so we would go a long way to stemming the spread of fake news if we would just stop, pause, and be reflective and do a simple Google search to ask ourselves, is this really true, before we share it? And a vast majority of that fake news can be debunked very easily with a single Google search. Third, we have to check our emotional pulse. As we found in our 10-year study of Twitter, fake news is salacious, anger-inducing, and blood-boiling. So if it's getting your blood boiling, you should take an emotional beat, take a step back, and sort of ask yourself, is this real or is it fake? And then finally, just considering the original source of the information. A lot of times, fake news comes from these websites that masquerade as real news, but are really just fake news sites that are made to look like a real news site. An example might be CNN.lt.com, where there's a little bit of a difference in the URL and it's masquerading as something, or it sounds like it could be legitimate, but it's not exactly like the thing that you've heard before. That's a sure sign that this could be fake news.
Can we take a moment quickly to go through some of because the data is very, very compelling in your book around what happened in Crimea before the interference in the US election, because I think it gives people a very good sense of how misinformation or disinformation is used to either disrupt or to actually create outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about Crimea? Because I didn't know the details of that.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the most eye-opening studies and situations that I came across. And that's why I opened the book with this example, because it, for me, was, a James Bond movie-esque description of the reality of what happens with social media. And so I actually present new evidence in the book that didn't exist in any of our studies, where I went back through our Twitter data and examined specifically the fake news that was happening around the Crimean annexation. And what I found, and the story that I describe in the book, is that the Russian annexation of Crimea obviously had a very well organized military component, but it also had a very well organized, perhaps one of the most well organized information warfare components that we've ever seen. And that information warfare strategy had two prongs to it. First, they used bots to essentially report all pro-Ukrainian bloggers as false news or hate speech or porn, to get those pro-Ukrainian Crimean and pro-Ukrainian blogger voices silenced. And then they spread false narratives that would appeal to the international community and the Crimean community to paint the picture of this as an accession from a Crimea that wants to be part of Russia rather than a forceful annexation. So they spread false memes, and they used bots and human actors to do that in order to frame the reality on the ground in Crimea, both for the domestic population and for the international community, as being much more of a willing population wanting to have an accession and become part of Russia, rather than this being a forceful annexation of a part of a country that wants to remain Ukraine.
Obviously, we've just seen the election result in the United States with Biden and Harris elected as president and vice president. But you also studied the 2016 election, where Trump was successful over Hillary Clinton, and you also studied the use of social media to sway voters in different directions. I was amazed to read that sometimes voters weren't being swayed to vote one way or another. It was being suggested to them not to vote at all. What data did you gather there? How did you learn what had happened in the lead up and around the 2016 United States election?
Yeah, so I really take a very scientific view of election manipulation, and it's not just the US, it's happening all over the world. It's happening in many, many countries. We've seen elections in Brazil, in Germany, in the UK. We had the Brexit vote. We had the American elections. Study by Oxford University found that a full third of the information around the Swedish general election floating around on social media was false news. And so this has a global importance. And in terms of elections and the scientific evidence of election manipulation, there are really three questions. The first is, does manipulation affect vote choice, which is who you vote for? The second is, does election manipulation affect voter turnout, which means which side turns out more? And third, is the reach, scope, and targeting of misinformation sufficient to move an election? And really, in summary, and I go through all of the detailed studies in the book, the summary is that there's not much good evidence that manipulation on social media can affect vote choice. So it's not really going to get a Clinton supporter to vote for Trump or a Trump supporter to vote for Clinton in enough magnitude to make a difference. But the evidence on effects on voter turnout are much scarier. There are a lot of very large studies that show statistically significant and economically and meaningful significant results on voter turnout, which means that social media can sway voter turnout effects. And for instance, Facebook ran experiments in 2010 and in 2012 in elections in the United States among 60 million people or more, randomized experiments that showed that they could create up to 800,000 additional votes cast in an election with a single message propagated over Facebook. And in the United States, George W. Bush beat Al Gore by 537 votes in Florida in the year 2000. So those kind of voter turnout effects matter. It's been shown through research that about 90 to 95% of the manipulative messages sent over Instagram during the 2016 election were voter suppression memes targeted at communities like the African American community, essentially telling them to stay home and to not vote. We definitely saw those kind of manipulative messages in the 2020 election in the United States in key swing states. The final question is the reach, scope, and targeting sufficient? And what we find there is that the reach and scope is very large, and that, in fact, in 2016 and in 2020, Russia targeted swing states disproportionately in the US election. So while I can't definitively say that either 2016 or 2020 was tipped in one direction or the other by Russian manipulation, I also can't rule it out. And I don't think we can rule it out in any part of the world without doing more research.
We're in a moment in history where, we've had Brexit, we've had the years we've had looking on at the United States of America. We're at a moment in a time of great flux, where there's a real, I feel like the choices we have to make around our decisions politically around the climate are more and more and more pointed. And there is a sensation with social media that the voices, as you say, the opinion economy, are getting louder and they're getting nastier, that there's the gap between what people believe is greater and greater. I suppose I wanted to ask you about political polarization. And to what extent, what story does the data tell us from what you discovered about whether the hype machine, whether social media actually does increase that political polarization, which in turn affects how we debate, who we can talk to, and how we vote?
This is probably one of the most important questions around social media of our generation. You certainly are seeing very sharp rises in affective polarization in the United States and other places in the world, where affective polarization is the hatred between parties. And what I do in the book is I have a chapter called "The Wisdom and the Madness of Crowds," which goes.
Great chapter. Yeah.
This is one of my favorite chapters. Now, James Surowiecki wrote this great book called The Wisdom of Crowds back in 2004, which was based on a theory that was originally written down by Sir Francis Galton 100 years earlier, which is that crowds can be wiser than individuals or experts if the crowd's opinion is orchestrated in a certain way. And the wisdom of crowds relies on three fundamental principles, which is the diversity of opinions in the crowd, the independence of the opinions in the crowd, and the equality in terms of the share of voice of opinions in the crowd. And the only problem with Surowiecki's Wisdom of Crowds thesis is that it was written in the same year that Mark Zuckerberg invented Facebook, because social media fundamentally undermines every single one of these three pillars: equality, independence, and diversity. And part of the story around equality and independence is about polarization. And I go through multiple studies, experimental studies, large-scale studies that show that the algorithms of social media inspire us to read more narrowly. They are inspiring us to read more of what we like, which puts us into these cocoons of getting more information that are not only more of what we like, but more similar to what our colleagues are reading and more different than what people on the other side of the aisle are reading. And that this directly affects the degree of affective political polarization through, for instance, Facebook's algorithms. This and how we deal with it is probably one of the most important questions for our civil society going forward.
It's a very big question, but it's really a should platforms be responsible for what they publish, or can they be regulated? What do you think about that?
Well, the whole last chapter of the book, which is the final chapter, the longest chapter in the book, is about what do we do? What can we do to solve this crisis? And really, the chapter essentially outlines multiple market failures that exist: privacy, election integrity, the spread of falsity, the lack of competition in social media. And when you have market failure, you have to have incentives for platforms to change. And in some cases, we're going to need regulation to create those incentives. And in particular, I think we need to have more government intervention around speech, drawing the line between free speech and harmful speech. I'm a big advocate of free speech. I think it's essential to free and fair democracy. I don't believe in censorship, but I do believe that there are limits to free speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. We have laws against libel and defamation and hate speech for a reason. Sometimes in the United States, for instance, the First Amendment protections for free speech will contravene 14th Amendment protections of equal protection under the law. And so we do need to be able to draw lines between free speech and harmful speech. And I believe that the best place to do that is not in 5-person politically appointed commissions like we have in the United States, the FCC or the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Communications Commission, which are politically appointed, but rather in deliberative, representative, legislative bodies like the Congress, which are representative and deliberative. And for instance, we in the United States have created laws against speech that would advertise sex trafficking on social media as an example of a line drawn by the legislature around where free speech should end and where harmful speech begins. We also have regulation of political speech in the United States, which should be extended to social media. We have, for instance, the Honest Ads Act sitting in front of Congress right now that isn't passed. I believe we need to pass laws like that. But really the entry ticket to solving this crisis is to create competition in the social media economy, because competition is going to create incentives for the platforms to change themselves. Right now, they don't have those incentives because they enjoy a lot of market share. They don't have a lot of competition. And so they can basically do whatever they want because we don't have anywhere else to go if we want social media besides the major players. In order to get competition, we have to think about how we regulate. And the first thing people think of when I say we need competition is, oh, you mean break up Facebook? That is not what I mean. And the reason I don't mean that, there's a whole chapter 5, devoted to the economics of how social media works. And the underlying economics of social media are that it is run on network effects. Now, network effects mean that the value of a social media platform comes from its size. The bigger it is, the more value it has, and the greater power it has. And so if that's the underlying economics of the social media economy, if you break up the leading player, say Facebook, it will just tip the next Facebook-like company into dominance, because the underlying economics tip companies into concentrated positions in an economy that runs on network effects. To really solve the competition problem in social media, we need structural reform of the economy itself, which comes through interoperability, data portability, and social network portability. We need legislation that implements all three. In fact, in the United States, we have an act in front of Congress, again, not passed yet, called the Access Act, that would force any social media platform greater than 100 million users to become interoperable. A great example of social network portability is when we forced the cell phone providers to allow you to take your number with you when you changed from one cell phone provider to another. Studies have shown that this increased competition and increased consumer welfare tremendously. And we should institute similar things. I should be able to take my social network with me from Facebook to another social network. Facebook should be interoperable with the other major social networks, and so on.
You write powerfully about data portability in the book, and we haven't actually talked about the importance of data. You know, for people who remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal, you know, it's not a new thing that companies or marketers have asked for our data. Maybe the difference in the past was that they asked head on. We were called on the telephone, we were stopped on the street, or we were asked to do a survey. But the issue now about the amount of data that people pour into these social media platforms that we're not aware that we pour into, is some of this also about educating users more and more, and also educating users so that they can put pressure on companies to allow the data to be portable in social media the way it is in telecommunications?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that number one, a big theme in the book is that we need more transparency, which involves educating users, but also essentially forcing the platforms to be a lot more transparent than they are about what data they have, how do they collect it, how do the algorithms work, and so on. And so I have a big call in the book for greater transparency, algorithmic transparency, data transparency, policies that are transparent, and so on. The public should know how all of this works, and that is a big part of how we get out of this mess. But I also think that we need more consumer control of their own data. Currently, that doesn't really exist to the level it should, and that is a big part of data and social network portability.
There's a fantastic quote that I want to read in the final chapter of the book. You write, "Today we're at a crossroads of privacy and security, free speech and hate speech, truth and falsity, democracy and authoritarianism, inclusion and polarization," all the things we've been talking about. While the hype machine is not solely responsible for any of these outcomes, it plays a role in all of them. Coming to terms with social media's influence on our democracy, our economy, and the very fabric of our civil society leads to inevitable questions. How can we adapt? And that's really the last question I want to put to you. If we are at a crossroads, and designers know we're at a crossroads, and maybe more and more users know we are at a crossroads, in which direction do we need to go so that we strike a balance between the promise of social media and the peril of social media?
This is the whole point of the book, and I'm so glad that you raised that here at the end. This really is the reason that I wrote the book. I do believe that the next 18 to 24 months are critical for how we deal with what I call the four levers that we have at our disposal to steer us towards the promise and away from the peril. The four levers are money, code, norms, and laws. The money refers to the business models of the platforms, which then incentivize how people use them, how advertisers use them, and how the platforms are designed. The code is how the platforms are designed and how the algorithms that run the platforms are designed. The norms are how we adopt and appropriate these technologies and use them, and what norms we develop around their use. And then the laws are how we regulate social media in order to achieve the promise and avoid the peril. We have to use all four of these levers simultaneously. All of these oars need to be rowing in the same direction in order to steer us away from the impending rocks and towards calmer waters. And I think that when it comes to the last chapter of the book, I try not to talk about platitudes, silver bullets, or euphemisms or general terms. I get very detailed about precisely what we need to be doing with these four levers in terms of specific laws, specific types of business models, specific types of designs, transparency around those designs, choice being put into the consumer's hands, and so on. And that really is the point of the book, is to really begin a conversation about the social solution now that we're all aware of the social dilemma that we face.
And I think we started this conversation by talking about how the human brain works, how extraordinary it is, our capacity for social engagement. And it's like now we need to be reminded of that in a book as great as yours in order to draw on our own power to make some changes that will also shape how we engage with social media. Sinan Aral, thank you very much for being a guest of the Brisbane Writers Festival, and thank you for all your comments today.
It's a true pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I want to say thank you to everyone who's watched this program. There are going to be a lot more events online for Brisbane Writers Festival. So to keep in touch with them, make sure you check their website. But for now, stay well, stay safe, and thank you for watching.